you weren't a fan of paleo, saying they they want to exclude the dairies, essentially.
I'm so not a fan of that.
And why not?
Dairy is the best one-stop shop in nature that we know of for muscle building and bone building nutrition, all in one shot. And it does that stuff spectacularly.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at the totality of evidence for or against dairy, it is, I would even say, overwhelmingly in favor of dairy when you look at all the different health parameters.
Mm-hmm.
So, and yeah, people will point to the fact that 2/3 of the population is lactose intolerant. So therefore, 2/3 of the population shouldn't eat dairy. Well, guess what? There's things that are low lactose. There's a lot of dairy foods that are low lactose. You know, everything from cheese to certain types of yogurt.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be swilling down milk all day
Right.
and feel like that's the only dairy source.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So what about people who say that dairy is causing this inflammation in their body, and like that we should avoid milk and cheeses and all these other things?
Mm-hmm.
What's your response to when somebody is saying that?
It's just a matter of, okay, well, that sounds good at maybe a visceral or gut level, or it sounds good on paper. Dairy, inflammation, yeah, I remember sucking down a ton of milkshakes and then I was freaking bloated the next day, But when you look at the scientific literature, you do a search on dairy and inflammation, PubMed, you will find an overwhelming amount of data showing that dairy is either neutral or beneficial to decreasing inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that I actually looked up within the past few years because the whole dairy and inflammation thing started circulating the internet.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that sounds interesting. And so when you look at the evidence, you're like, wow, it's just the exact opposite. Yeah. So,
and those weren't studies sponsored by the dairy industry.
They probably were.
Okay. All right. We had to get that caveat.
They probably were sponsored by Big Milkshake.
Okay.
But there is some interesting research. Like, dairy cannot be looked at as this homogeneous unit, like this single food. Dairy foods have different effects on health depending on the dairy food. So something, for example, we'll take butter.
Mm-hmm.
Butter makes stuff taste good. And so things that taste good can improve your mood and improve your quality of life. And as long as you keep them within moderation and you consume them judiciously, and then you don't consume them within the context of a diet that's overall too much calories and you're accumulating body fat and you're sedentary and you're smoking and you're drinking like a fish, butter's fine.
Right.
Now, if you compare the effects of butter with the effects of cheese, this is a freaking interesting line of research. Cheese happens to be fine with blood lipids. It has a neutral effect on blood lipid profile.
Really?
So certain blood lipid profiles or trends can be atherogenic, meaning it's going to lead you down the path towards heart disease, which is typically the increase in LDL and decrease in HDL. Cheese doesn't do that. It's very freaking interesting. Huh. Now, if you look at butter, on the other hand, well, butter can have a tendency to do that.
Okay.
So we can't look at dairy as a single entity.
Okay.
Yeah, there's wrinkles to that.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're looking at like a Greek yogurt versus cheese versus butter versus milk, like you can't put them all into one boat there.
You can't roll them all up into one. Yeah.
Okay.